Grand Theft Terra Firma is a game guide to an imaginary video game. There is no video game. These two panels are extremely important, the two behind you, because they kind of tell you what the game is, and they also speak to the power bars. But in Grand Theft Terra Firma, we reframed the theft of Soktomuk, which is the Fraser Valley, as premeditated grand theft, stoked by racism and fueled by greed. With this project, we've kind of flipped the foundational myth of Canada on its head, and instead of looking from the point of view that is typically told of the Canadian history, that Europeans came to an unoccupied land, where the people here were not using it, and we brought them education, and we brought progress to this land and made life for ourselves. We flipped that whole narrative on our head. And we hope that it serves as a bridge for non-Indigenous folk to move out of denial and into understanding of what lies between us. These two panels are super important to understanding this show. The first panel sort of situates you within the game, what the game's purpose is. And the second panel is your life bars or your power bars. So the two power bars we have is your prejudice bar and your empathy bar. So to win the game, you have to power up your prejudice. And what will make you lose the game is your empathy. And if you hit full empathy, you give up your life of crime and get back on the boat and go home. So in video games, often you have to choose a character that you play, and this is what we call the gang of thieves that were are stereotypes, archetypes of the colonial machine that rolled into this part of the world starting in basically 1858, when the gold rush happened.
We did a lot of research in source materials as well as in academic histories and newspapers. We were interested in how there wasn't one specific thief. The British Empire, by the time it rolled into Saltamook, the Fraser Valley, Saltamook, was really a well-oiled machine. It was 1858, we'd been doing this for a while. And so we, essentially with the characters, we personified the machine of the empire, if you will. And so we selected these archetypes who together commit the crime. Each of them plays a role that is important in the overall taking of the land. The first paragraphs that are underneath these portraits give you a sense and situate the characters within the British Empire at the time. We did a lot of historical research to figure out how to situate them. And each one of them has a mission that they play in this part of the gang of thieves. So for instance, if you play the whiskey trader, playing the whiskey trader makes you the drug dealer in the game. Your character traffics in addictions, unleashes mayhem among the natives. Your contribution to the heist is to take resistance out of the knees. So each character has their own specific mission, and they add up to a gang of thieves, which is a picture of the colonial machine as it rolled into Soktomuk. And really, the way the British Empire operated, each of these characters, the roles are all critical to the ultimate act of taking the land. They all contribute. And one of the reasons for creating the bios and doing research into the larger sense of what was going on in the British Empire in other parts at that time was just to really acknowledge that we all live within the context of our times, and to try and sketch in a larger sense of the context of the era that these characters were inhabiting.
You'll notice that each of the characters is photographed against this backdrop here. And I've done a lot of research in the Chilliwack archives, and have been looking through a bunch of photographs taken by a photographer called Charles Bourne at the time. And I kept on looking at these photographs, and
there were lots of pioneers and people standing up in front of it, and there was one really incredible one where there was a dead cougar and two hunters had the dead cougar and it was standing in front of this backdrop. But it was the backdrop that really intrigued me. What did that backdrop represent? Well, it represented the dreams and desires of the newcomers to put down little England with its tokery hedges and its fountain onto the landscape. So that's why I made it up. And so it's a group of friends, I got them to recreate the backdrop and we photographed them on there. This carpet used to be in our living room. It perfectly fit the theme. In video games, you have to collect power objects that allow you to complete your mission. So these are the power objects. I was really struck by this glass bell jar that were really popular at the time as home decorations. And for me, this really encapsulated the European view of the land, where we and I'll just read it. This glass parlor dome encloses flowers that never fade. It sings an ode to an idealized nature created by human hand that knows no seasons. And the power of it is it aligns with the mission of shaping the land to your will. I had an experience, we were listening many, many years ago. David Suzuki came to the University of the Fraser Valley and he gave a talk. And he talked about a tribe that he'd visited in Brazil who pointed to a mountain and they said, "That's God." And David's point was that how can you cut down a mountain if you think it's God? You can't do that. You can't turn it into a gravel pit and aggregate. You just can't do it. And I came home from there. We were living in a small little farm at the time. And there was a little hill behind us, and I started calling it Little God. And it made me really reflect on our different ideas, indigenous and non-indigenous, on the value of land. And I really see how our European values only value things when they are either cut down, forests are cut down and made into money, fish are caught and sold for profit, land is divided up into sections and sold, as opposed to being valuable for what it is, for its beingness, if there is a word.
You know, we always acknowledge when we make this work that these are not, you know, the racism that made the theft possible is not, it's not easy to look at. It's not easy to unpack in ourselves. We're conditioned to it. These are the stories that we were told when we were growing up, and these prejudiced ways of seeing things are embedded within them. And so for me, in the process of making this show, and we made it over a period of about 5 years, the power objects were a place where I was really grappling with the different aspects of that racism. And in going through some of the different power objects, getting a sense of what pieces of that
the foundational myth
of Canada, what aspects of it were kind of embedded in some of these different objects. And so in the far corner we have the Doctrine of Discovery. So between about 1450 and about 1500, there's a sequence of popes who write these papal bulls that come to be known as the Doctrines of Discovery. And essentially they were motivated by royalty coming to the popes and saying, we want to feel okay about ourselves as Christians, but we also want to go and there's a bunch of Africans we kind of want to extract from where they live, and we want to use them as labor, and there's some lands we want to go take as our own, and we just kind of want to do it, and we might have to kill a bunch of people in the process. And so there's this series of documents that are written that and there were some pretty dodgy popes in that in that time. Essentially, what they did was they said that if you're a believer, then it's okay to do things to people who are not believers. If they're not believers, they're not truly human, and you can take their bodies, you can take their lands, you can do whatever is required to convince them to believe in the same God, to become believers. And within that is this idea that this racist idea, this core of white supremacy, which is that my God is better than your God. You know, the Doctrine of Discovery is still one of the legal basis, one of the legal foundations for the Crown sovereignty in Canada. Like, it's still one of the legal foundations for how the Canadian government claims to own the land.
And the power of this Doctrine of Discovery power object is it makes you think your land grab has the green light from God. So we always have this humorous way of trying to get this across.
In framing this story of settlement as a crime, we reflected on, so what would be the smoking gun? What's the murder weapon? And we came up with the surveyor's chain. They're called Gunter's chains, after the English pastor who invented it as a system for marking land.
And this chain takes the measure of the land invented by an English pastor who records numbers that divide the countryside, turns forests and meadows into real estate that can be bought and sold. And so it was really the alien knowledge system that was brought in that cut up the land to turn it into parcels that could be sold. Over here in this corner we have what is the Colonial Secretary's desk in London. And the Colonial Secretary was the mastermind, if you will, of the crime, and basically ran the British Empire. But everything has been historically researched. So there's a letter here that is sent from the governor in British Columbia to the Colonial Secretary, and Sandra sourced through many dispatches that were sent. The University of Victoria has a lot of access to stuff if you want to research further, and so the words are taken mostly from those dispatches. I mean, they're from different dispatches, but we package them together.
I think another important thing to look at here is the map. So this is one of the first maps of British Columbia. We couldn't believe it when we stumbled on it, and it's called the New El Dorado. 1858 is when it's created.
Part of our research, we ran into this book that was published in 1862. So Commander R.C. Main, who was a Royal Marine, was kind of a spy who was sent about, and in his book that he wrote about it, he told some wonderful stories. One of the stories that really struck me was that they traveled from Fort Langley up to Hope, and they hired a canoe from Skowlitz. Skowlitz is a reserve that's very close to us. And the thing that struck, when they talked about the traveling, and they said two things that really struck me was one, that the paddlers never slept. They sang and they paddled all day long, all night long, and took these guys 4 days up the thing. So an incredible feat of knowledge. But the subtitle of this book, so the title is 4 Years in British Columbia or Vancouver Island. But the subtitle is an account of their forests, rivers, coast, gold fields, and resources for colonization. So an account of their. If I was a lawyer, I'd be using this as evidence of the theft, right? And for me, it was like, Jesus, there it is, premeditated grand theft. And of course, on here we've got The Origin of Species, Darwin's book, which was really used at the time to promote the idea that Europeans, and especially British people, were at the top of the evolutionary ladder. Social Darwinism. And there's a book over here, The Common Sense Medical Advisor, which kind of operated like the BC Health book that kind of gave you how to cure the common cold, etc. But in the middle of it was all of this pseudoscience suggesting that indigenous folk were inferior to Europeans. Which, and the power of it is it backs up your bigotry.
screenshot room. This is where you get into the actual play of the game. But I wanted to start just by acknowledging how crucial the involvement of Indigenous people has been in making this work. We had a group of Stolo advisors, formal advisors, as well as consulting with the House of Respect, which is a formal committee that Stolo Nation has in making the work. And then as well with folks who appear in the photographs, we drew from friends, neighbors, and from the Stolo community in making the photographs. So just always super important to acknowledge the involvement of Indigenous people, and also to say that, we're not saying anything new with this work. Like, this is what Indigenous people have been saying since our white forebears arrived on Turtle Island, and that's that this is their land, and that we've taken it, and that is wrong. So there you go. Now we can talk about the screenshots. We opted for a pretty collaborative, transparent approach to making the pictures. So we had conversations with all of our actors before we went to the studio with them, made sure they understood what the work was and were comfortable with that. And in the case of the Stolo actors, we asked them to talk about their characters and then asked them to bring their own clothes. And so identify something from within their own wardrobe that they would like to wear, and then worked with whatever they had brought for their clothes. So this photograph here speaks to the residential school experience, and it's St. Mary's Residential School was one of the first schools in British Columbia. It was in the early 1860s that they started the school in Mission, and this photograph is inspired by a passage from the journals of one of the Oblate fathers who was working at the school, and he writes about how when they were getting to the end of the school year, they would take the children up a mountain that the Stolo called Devil's Mountain. And for the Stolo, it was a place where you didn't go. It was a bad place to be. And so all year, the Oblate fathers told the children, we're going to go on a hike and we're going to sleep overnight at the top of Devil's Mountain. And by the end of the school year, they then took them, and the priest actually writes, he says, now the children know that it is the priest who speaks truth, because they went to the top of Devil's Mountain and they came back and they didn't die. And so they know that me and my God are the ones who speak truth and not their parents and their cultural knowledge keepers. I've disproved their truth, if you will. And you can imagine the disjunct that it would cause in families when the children went home after having been on this place that their parents had asked them not to go to and had never been to themselves. So one of the things that we really wanted to do was to show that there was resistance, that Indigenous people weren't just like, yeah, sure, take our land, okay, that's fine. And we just really liked in this, and this just emerged this way, to show that resistance with Ocean sticking her tongue out behind the back of the priest, just to give that sense, hey, that this was not just a fait accompli, there was resistance.
And here we have our two wild cards. So as you're completing your mission, if you run into these folks, they start to foil your attempts at stealing land.
The few good whites are a nod to those whites, those settlers, who were aligned with Indigenous interests and did have the empathy and recognize that what was going on was wrong. And it was interesting to read some of the discussions in the papers. You can find those kinds of discussions going on. And then we also have Homeland Security. We have a real powerhouse of Stolo characters in there. Carrie Lynn Victor, who's our 007 character, is a remarkable artist. And Kayla Muscle, who's our punk with the red hair, is she's famous as one of the few female bronc riders in Canada. Probably anywhere, really.
So again, we wanted a place where you would go and power up your racism. But okay, we'll create an outhouse and we'll call it Old MacDonald's, on Old MacDonald's farm. And so your player has to go and power up your racism as soon as while you're playing the game, racism is going down. You have to go power it up in the outhouse. So inside the outhouse we have British colonies newspapers encircled in red. You see the explicit racism that was the programming of the day, essentially, that made us racist, that gave us the ability to dehumanize the indigenous folk and not see them as worthy of respect. All these photographs are taken from actual historical happenings. The Fraser Valley was flooded by 30,000 miners within a couple of months. They came up from California, and they arrived just before winter. When the winter came, they were starting to starve, and it was the Stolid people that fed them and kept them alive over that winter. The Stolid people and indigenous folk across the island really played a crucial role in teaching Europeans arriving on how to live in the land, and it's something that's never been respected.
This guy is about to get on the boat and go back home. He's gotten himself into a situation. He's one of the Royal Engineers. He's surveying the border, actually, the 49th parallel, and he's so badly mosquito bitten that he just can't stand it. And he comes around the corner. It's in his journal, and this woman offers to treat his wounds, and she does that, and he is, as we say in here, the caring ways of this family will make you reconsider your notions about their inferiority. Recognizing their humanity brings on an existential crisis, causing you to abandon your life of crime. Yeah, I think one of the things that's been really encouraging as we've toured with this show across the country has been how open people are to learning this flipped on its head narrative about the founding of our country. I think we're at a time when people are ready to move forward in a way that puts us all at the banquet table together, which is where we should be.